Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode in our series, The End of the World as You Know It. I'm your guest lecturer, Dr. Scott McKenzie, and today we'll discuss the 2nd and 3rd chapters of the book of Revelation that the Apostle John wrote. Remember, though, in chapter 1, Jesus told John to write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after this. And so, in obedience to Christ's command, John wrote down the things which he had seen, and that was Jesus on the island of Patmos. And then Jesus told John to write down the things which are, referring to the letters John wrote to the 7 specific churches in Turkey. Last was a command concerning modern Israel, and that was to write the things which will take place after this. And that, my friends, refers to the events recorded in chapter 4 all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. Now, to write this, John was taken off the island of Patmos into heaven. John was raptured into God's presence to witness the breaking of the first seal. And with the breaking of the first seal began the last week, or last 7 years, of Daniel's 70th week prophecy. But for this episode, we'll discuss those 7 churches targeted by Jesus, which are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamon, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These 7 churches really existed when John was under arrest on the island of Patmos. These 7 churches as well were represented in heaven as 7 golden lampstands. Why? Because I believe they represent the holding up of God's word, God's light to the world. They were not the light, Jesus is. They were the stands holding up the light. 30 years ago, when I began to study this book, I discovered that these churches listed in chapters 2 and 3 were not only real churches in John's day. I was taught that each church represented a period of time in church history. So you have 7 churches representing 7 historic periods in the church age, an age in which you and I live today. Let me explain this to you as we start with the church in Ephesus. Ephesus represented the apostolic church period from Acts chapter 2, when the church began, to around 100 AD, when the last apostle, John, died. The next period is represented by the church in Smyrna. Smyrna represents the persecuted church age, from 100 AD up to when Constantine the Emperor made Christianity the Roman Empire's official religion around 316 AD. Now that takes us to the Pergamum period. Pergamum represents the world church in our church timeline. That would be from 316 AD up to 800 AD. Then we come to Thyatira. Thyatira represented the medieval church period from 800 AD to 1517 AD in our church timeline. Now coming in at number 5 is Sardis. Sardis represented the rise of the state church from 1517 AD to 1750 AD. Whereas Philadelphia represents the missionary church period in our church history timeline from 1750 AD to 1900 AD. And then coming in at number 7 is Laodicea. Laodicea represents a wealthy and prosperous church period in our history timeline from 1900 AD to the present time, or until the rapture of the church, which was prophesied by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 4. So consider, as you read chapters 2 and 3, you need to remember that these were real churches, but they could also represent periods in church history. Isn't it awesome to consider how the old-time scholars were able to compare what was happening to these real churches to periods of time in the church history timeline? And if they're right, then Jesus chose these churches not only because they needed to be warned and encouraged to be faithful, but because they would represent different periods in the history of the church, as well as warning us today, because class, I've been taught that we live in the Laodicean period. And if you want to know more about the Laodicean period, then read chapter 3 in the letter that John dictated for Jesus to the church of Laodicea. A time in the church timeline age when churches would be wealthy, when some would turn Christianity into a money-making business. Even so, Jesus said to those believers way back in John's day in Laodicea, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in. And to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me. He who has an ear, let him hear." And though we live in the Laodicean church period in our church timeline, Jesus' offer hasn't changed. He stands at the door of your heart knocking. Will you let him in? Will you let Jesus take you to heaven? And so with that said, we come to the end of this episode in our series, The End of the World as You Know It, a condensed version of end time prophecy. I'm Dr. Scott Mackenzie. Goodbye for now.